Here's what's coming today on the Woodworking Network podcast.
We see a lot of competition with steel and concrete because it's competitive in those types of buildings right now. Those big massive heavy timber, 4 or 5 story office buildings, things like that. There, it's already competitive.
Welcome to the 5th season of the Woodworking Network podcast and a new episode. Join us as we explore the business of woodworking, big and small, and what it takes to succeed. I'm Will Sampson. Today's episode is sponsored by FDMC Magazine. My guest is Todd Beyreuther, Director of Product Development for Mercer Mass Timber. He's at the forefront of a dynamic and growing construction trend. But first, I want to talk about reaching for the sky. What is it that makes us continually seek higher ground? Is it some primitive tactical response needing to see farther or look down on an opponent or threat? Children play king of the hill or seek the highest point on the tallest piece of equipment on the playground. Maybe it's something we have deep in our DNA from ancestors who lived in trees, seeking the heights to escape ground-based predators. Whatever it is, this perennial reaching for the sky is particularly evident in our fascination with tall buildings. Ancient pyramids and towers touched the sky thousands of years ago with impressive stone and brick structures that even today are marvels of construction. Indeed, construction techniques and materials have defined the limits of our building structures since the beginning of time. But we always stretch the limits of materials and invent new techniques to climb ever higher. For more than a century, steel and concrete have defined what could be called the age of the modern skyscraper, allowing structures to surpass 1,500 feet in height. But there is a new player looking to touch the sky, and it's actually one of the oldest building materials known to man: wood. While it's a long way from competing with the tallest buildings in the world, new buildings built of wood are almost daily reaching new heights around the world. There are plans on the drawing boards for wood buildings as tall as 70 stories. These buildings are examples of what has been called mass timber construction. They make use of cross-laminated timber and other technologies that extend the structural capabilities of wood to make construction way taller than the trees the wood originally came from. So why revisit wood to build skyscrapers? The answer has to do with efficiency and concerns about the environment. Mass timber buildings are estimated to be just 1/4 of the weight of conventional steel and concrete structures. Plus, steel and concrete, especially concrete, are not exactly climate-positive materials. Some estimates say mass timber buildings reduce a structure's carbon footprint by as much as 75%. Construction with wood also has production efficiency advantages. It allows many parts of a structure to be fabricated in factories rather than on-site, and those lighter wood assemblies can be easily transported from the factory to the building site for installation in the building assembly, saving time and construction costs. That makes mass timber construction attractive, not just for tall buildings, but also for low-rise, multi-story constructions, competing with steel and concrete on the ground floor, so to speak. While most of our audience in the woodworking industry is focused on building the furnishings and cabinets that go inside buildings, there are new opportunities to build big buildings themselves. Maybe your next project could reach for the sky. Before we get to our interview with Todd Beyreuther, let's pause for a word from our sponsor. FDMC Magazine is your vital source of information to improve your woodworking business. Whether it is keeping you apprised of the latest advances in manufacturing, helping you solve your wood technology problems with Gene Wengert, or inspiring you with case histories about successful businesses and best practices, FDMC Magazine is there to be the sharpest business tool in your shop. Learn more and subscribe for free at woodworkingnetwork.com/FDMC. Now let's talk about mass timber construction with Todd Beyreuther. Today our guest is Todd Beyreuther, Director of Product Development for Mercer Mass Timber. He's at the forefront of a dynamic and growing construction trend. Welcome to the Woodworking Network podcast, Todd.
Well, thank you, and I'm really honored to be here.
Well, that's great. Now, let's start at the beginning. The audience for this podcast is mostly people involved with manufacturing in wood products sector, but not all of them are active in construction, and they might not be familiar with mass timber. Can you give us a quick summary of what it is and why it matters?
Yeah, and I think just your lead in there is kind of the origin story. We all come from, some background, whether it's, architecture, engineering, or, in my case, construction. And then we found our way into this manufacturing world, and mass timber, really just fits that, that kind of prefabrication, world really well. By definition, what it really means is it's a new construction type, new materials in the building codes. And the mass part is really a performance strategy, on how a building performs in fire and, in terms of structure and so forth. So that's kind of how we start with that category. But then, as you see behind over my shoulder here, we're in a factory setting. It takes, advanced manufacturing kind of methodologies to achieve.
So what we're talking about is using large wood products instead of concrete and steel to build buildings, correct?
Yeah, it often gets pitted against the other materials like concrete and steel because those are the mature technologies, right? So it's very much like the way we build buildings out of concrete and steel. But I also like to I spend a lot of my time, bringing mass timber into hybrid approaches with light frame wood and cold form steel. So I think, as we are maturing as an industry, and we're not yet an industry because we're still emerging, less than 5%. But as we do that, I think it's really important we make mass timber just as relevant with those low-rise light frame construction types as, the big
The high rises that get all the sex appeal.
they get all the attention and fine. They can get 90% of the attention and be 5% of the industry, but that it's one of those kind of stories. Yeah.
Now, what's Mercer's role in all of this? You're a manufacturer of the materials that are used in these kinds of constructions?
It starts there. So Mercer owns 3 factories, 2 in the U.S., 1 in Arkansas, and this one that I'm sitting at in Spokane, Washington, and then 1 in British Columbia. But it has to go beyond that to support a factory like this that can make the big dumb wood panels. It really takes teams of engineers, teams of kind of project construction managers, and then really directly teams that can do all that computer modeling and control the robotics, the CNC milling machines, things like that. So that's really crucial to support a big factory like this.
Yeah, we talk a lot about CNC manufacturing in woodworking environment, mostly talking about 5x12 and
Yep.
4x8 machines. I imagine there in Spokane, you've got machines that dwarf those rather incredibly.
They do, but I like the way, especially in the Northeast, that there is that now tradition of that light and heavy timber framing where the CNC machines are really important for those precision joints. But it really is the same concept. And I like to say, I used to teach in architecture, and as an architecture student, they like to control these smaller CNC and laser cutters and so forth. And that's part of the appeal to mass timber is now you're just doing it with a 60 by 12 foot, CNC gantry.
Yeah.
But you're making the same type of models.
So right. It all looks the same on the computer, right? Well, it seems like every other week I hear about a new project to build an even taller building with mass timber construction. How fast is it growing and how big can it get? I'm very interested too to hear about you're talking about, lower level kind of
Yeah.
construction as well.
Yeah, so the reason mass timber, a lot of the attention goes to the big buildings, and we love those. I mean, they are absolutely, really important to the growth of our collective industry, and they're just frankly quite fun to design, right? As you get into these 8 to 12 stories and above, it's really satisfying to kind of to use timber, use a biogenic product, but also to kind of fill that gap. And that's one of the reasons the focus has been on that, is to fill that gap between where we normally would do low rise of 4, 5, or 6 stories with stick frame buildings, before, and then all the way up to 8 to 12 before steel and concrete really start making sense. And so that's why a lot of that focus has been on those mid-rise buildings. But the mid-rise buildings are, just a certain percentage of what we need to address our housing, on the West Coast, especially our housing crises. And so a lot of that need is going to be in those low rise kind of urban density buildings, 4, 6, 8 stories. So that is equal, it gets equal attention from us on the development side.
Can you tell us about the environmental story connected with mass timber? I mean, I think that that's a big part of what's been driving some of it, and a lot of people don't quite understand that. If they can get past the structural strength issues, they don't really understand the environmental issues.
Sure, sure. And I think I touched on, the fact that it's made out of a material. It's one of the three major materials that, actually grows, right? And so that biogenic piece is very, very important. But I think more importantly, as we get a little more surgical about where wood is harvested and why it's important to certain regions. I'm sitting in the inland Northwest, and we're in a very fire-prone area, and our forests are not managed well, as we know. So the challenge when they get overgrown is that they have a lot of fuel, to have these massive wildfires across Washington, Oregon, California, into Canada. So a lot of the motivation is also, how do we restore our forest? Can we create products that create markets to help support those forest restoration efforts? And then as we kind of move around the country, there's various reasons why, it might not just be wildfire, it might just be rural economies. And as we get into the west side of the coastal side of the Cascades, or we get down in the southeast, where a lot of these forests now are very mature, and it's a very important part of those rural economies, the timber industry.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you've got the just the basic quotient too of that wood is a carbon sink. It's holding that carbon in it, and if you put it in a building, it's likely to hold it longer than if it gets in a wildfire and then gives it all that carbon up.
Yep, absolutely. It's that, what we call the sequestration part. It's storing that carbon and trying to give a chance for the rapid regrowth of these forests. That if we can get ahead of those cycles, that's a very important part of the story.
So for people in the wood industry, why should they be interested in mass timber, even if they're not directly involved with building construction?
Yeah, there's a couple answers to that. I think, as we look at the balance of any supply chain or value chain that goes from that rural economy to the urban, market, perhaps. There really is an important piece about the balance of those products. If you're in the lumber industry, you better be in all the co-products that go with it. You better know what to do with those chips. Are they going to a pulp mill? Are they creating bioenergy? Are they going into some sort of petrochemical, replacement? All of that is really important to find that balance. If a pulp and paper mill goes down in a region, then it puts a lot of stress on the rest of the timber industry, the lumber, the so forth, because it's really finds its own historical balance. So I think that's something that probably doesn't get enough attention as we think about our health of our forests and health of our communities.
Is mass timber an opportunity for wood products manufacturers that are, more in traditional smaller scale situation? Can they expand their business going into that somehow? Or who is supplying materials for mass timber projects? Mercer
Yeah,
obviously, but
yeah, and like we were kind of touching on earlier, I spent a lot of time over the last few years really studying some of the, especially the manufacturers on the East Coast that are doing the more timber frame prefab. There might be wall panels, it might be volumetric, but also going to Sweden and Finland, Japan, and understanding where they have more of a culture of this prefabrication with engineered wood products. It might be glue lam, it might be LVL, and that's really where I see a lot of this going is yes, we'll always there's value in having the big 10-foot by 40-foot floor plates and so forth. But what do you do with the rest of that panel? If in our case we have a 12-foot by 60-foot press, the idea is we want to really always be efficient in the factory to drive that cost down. So we can make lots of posts and beams and studs and so forth with the rest of that material. Coming back to the question of why timber is maybe interesting from a design standpoint, it's because we also have a lot of freedom on how we, you know, build it up into certain billets and then break it back down with subtractive processes. There's really a lot of freedom on what sizes we use, and that's fun as a designer.
what's the cost comparison of this kind of construction versus more conventional kinds of construction?
Sure. So again, we see a lot of competition with steel and concrete because it's competitive in those types of buildings right now. Those big massive heavy timber, 4 or 5 story office buildings, things like that. There, it's already competitive, and then to get to be cost competitive in these low rise buildings like we're talking about, where we're mixing with light frame wood and cold form, then we have to be more efficient, like I was talking in the factory, and we can get there. We can get to parity and below, but the shift is it goes from what we call a design bid build process, where external architects and engineers are designing custom one-off buildings, to now we need to, like the rest of the wood industry, develop components and assemblies that then we have to always have freedom in design and geometry and so forth, but it's much more of a system approach than it is a custom one-off approach.
So closer to component built cabinets and things like that, the same way that that's constructed, and
I
we're
think so,
within the
right?
parameters of how things are built.
Yeah, we always will find those opportunities for those one-off, higher end, but to be relevant and more workforce housing or even affordable level housing, you have to drive down, find that system approach.
Now, historically, I think most of the timbers for this kind of construction have come from softwood sources, and you're in the softwood world in Spokane. But I've heard that partly to avoid transportation issues, that other places that are more near hardwood forests are trying to introduce hardwood mass timber. Is that anything that you can tell us about? Is that
Yep. Yep. No, it's absolutely possible and absolutely is important for, especially as in the Midwest and Northeast, that we start driving towards this hardwood. And in my experience, it's the softwood has been just very easy because kind of early adopters were using lumber products. So obviously the strength of the commodity lumber, market with the softwoods
Well,
is
people are
really what
used
drove
to
it.
softwoods for studs and
Yeah,
timbers. I mean, ancient Doug fir timbers were timber framed into buildings 100 years ago.
sure. And so, it's both good and bad that North America took that approach, because, it's good that it got it going, but it's bad. It's challenging. I won't say bad. It's challenging in the sense that we're competing for the same fiber as, the home builders and you know, the the big box stores and things like that. So I think in that sense, if you look at it, in all of the smaller mills in the Midwest and Northeast that can make more, like custom products like they do in Europe. We don't necessarily want a 2x6. That maybe is not the best shape, but a smaller mill doing hardwoods might be able to effectively do that.
Yeah, yeah. But it's still right now, I guess it's really concentrated on the softwoods. I know I did one story on a hardwood mass timber project, and they had to send their material to Montana to get it turned into beams and
Yeah,
machined and
yeah, yeah. That'll come around, but as you're right, as we I still have a handful of these manufacturers until we really grow. Yeah, that'll
Now, what's
be a
different
reality.
about the process for constructing a mass timber building compared to, say, concrete and steel? What goes on?
Well, I think the most important piece is that everything has an exact digital twin. So it has to work on the computer because we have to tell the CNC machines what to cut. So a lot of time up front to get that thing right, but then that pays off obviously when you come to the job site. So the job site's very different. You might have two or three people installing these large panels with a crane, and it's going very quickly to a 1 or 2 millimeter meter tolerance, and that's where you really see the difference. Is this that precision and that speed of construction, which leads to new challenges because what happens when you start to integrate that with a cast in place concrete elevator core? You really start to think about where those tolerances are when you get that precise.
So what's better about mass timber? Why should somebody go there? And what are the challenges? What's worse?
I think you always have to approach that with two different audiences. One is just is it faster, better, cheaper, so forth. And in a lot of cases, you can just say yes, whether you see it or not. The second piece is obviously there's an experiential piece. There is a reason why we want to be in these types of buildings. There's a biophilic response to, being in these types of structures. There's, obviously a value system if there's other on how we source these things. But I think you always have to be, somewhat flexible on either of those audiences.
Yeah, it's and you're talking about the mid-rise buildings and all that. I kind of like to go into that a little bit more. It sounds like there might be an opportunity for smaller folks for that as an entry point into this business. Is that true, or is that still take you got to have the big operations?
Well, I think there is a scale thing here where to deliver a big mid-rise building, multi stories. Yeah, that's kind of a different approach and scale than if we can make these components more available for smaller designers, smaller contractors, smaller developers, quite frankly, because when you get into infill projects, a townhome or a fourplex, as we start to see, our cities, especially on the West Coast, start to address their exclusionary practices of zoning and allow more density in the cities. We know this is one of the how we provide more housing units. Then we got to make that more available to that type of developer rather than doing a whole city block. Yeah.
So, what about one of the questions that always gets raised, and I think we just did a story, I think this week about some certification or test related to it. What about the fire issue with mass timber buildings?
Well, it's an important part of the story. So the mass piece is really speaking to that fire performance because it's very similar to if you're going to start a campfire with a bunch of kindling or start it with a log. The log will burn, but if you're starting it with a match, it's really about that controlled performance. And so we know it's very predictable, and the charring of the material is very understandable versus kind of a rapid fire in a light frame building. That's the difference in how the building and fire codes approach that, and as we as designers then use the material.
So the bottom line is that there's no additional hazard in the building. In fact, there might even be less of a hazard in the building because of that construction.
Yeah, it's the development of the building and fire codes for mass timber. They're still very, very conservative, and that's a good thing. Because as we are introducing a new material, we want to take the approach where we are conservative, and then as we learn over the years how to use this material, then we can start to open it up a little bit. And that's been the approach. So an example is when we first started introducing in the US to get to 8, 12, and 18 stories, as the difference between those three different you know heights is the amount of encapsulation. How much of the wood are you covering up? When you get to the 18-story building, you can't have any wood exposed. It's all completely covered by encapsulation, meaning sheetrock and so forth. Whereas the 8-story building could be completely exposed because they're different risk categories essentially. How many people in there? But in that middle class already, there's been more and more fire testing over the last few years in Sweden, and that has allowed fire officials and to understand better house performance. So now we're starting to see now more exposed ceilings and things like that. And I think that should bring a level of confidence to everyone that's working through this, that this is very thoughtful on this approach to including timber in these buildings.
So now, what's happening to increase acceptance of this form of construction? Is it just education? Is it project by project? I mean, how fast is this growing?
Well, it's interesting because I started in professional practice in structural engineering, went to academia because it was too early for the market for mass timber in about 2011, 2012. So we spent a lot of time in research and development, and then we started to see it included in the codes in 2015, 16. That was one of the big barriers, that kind of jurisdiction and code acceptance. Now I feel we're strongly there, and now we're on that verge of that hockey stick of growth, and that last piece there. Now that we have architects and engineers excited and understanding the technical side, we have the jurisdictions and the code officials understanding the acceptance piece, and then the third piece is, can we be competitive? Can we really drive down the cost? And that's a lot of what I do as a product director is how do we now scale this and make it more and more competitive? Because once that happens, then that's really the acceleration.
That's pretty exciting. Well, I definitely want to follow along as we see more growth in this business, literally growth elevating. I wonder how tall they're going to go next time, but it sounds very exciting. Now, if folks want to learn more about you and Mass Timber and Mercer, what's your website? I know you've got a website.
Yeah, thank you. Our website is mercermasstimber.com, and then from there you'll find a lot of great resources in partner organizations such as Woodworks and others that are really focused on that collective industry effort. Because, like I say, as we emerge as an industry, it's really about a collective coopetition, we call it.
Well, that's great. And it definitely is. This is the time to get in on the ground floor, so to speak.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you much, Todd. This has been really interesting. And we may have you back sometime to talk more about maybe some specific projects or something like that. That would be great.
Love to. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's it for today. If you're looking for more of our podcasts, you can find all of them at woodworkingnetwork.com/podcasts and in popular podcast channels. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks again to today's sponsor, FDMC Magazine. If you have a comment or topic you'd like us to explore, contact me at will.sampson@woodworkingnetwork.com. Thanks for listening.